I am Dan Grabois, and you're watching the $2 Broom podcast, in which I talk to interesting people. And I have one of those with me today. This is Ariel Beery. Hi, Ariel.
Hi, Dan.
And you have an American or an English and Hebrew pronunciation of your last name.
That's correct. Yeah.
So give us our two options here.
So in America, I go by Ariel Beery, and in Israel, my actual name is Ariel Beery,
Okay.
and I'm fine either way as long as you call. I'm good.
Good. Well, thank you for talking with me today. I found you maybe a year and a half ago because you were posting very interesting columns about the Israel-Palestine problems. And I've learned a little bit about you since then. And I have read your book, which is here, which is really
Thank you for
cool
reading it.
and interesting and kind of moving.
Mm,
And I want to talk about all those things, but I want to start with your career is not you're not a journalist necessarily,
no,
and you're doing really interesting things. So can we stay away from Israel Palestine for starters? Where'd you grow up? What kind of things did you study in college and where and how did what was your path?
sure, sure. So I was born in 1979 to Israeli parents who arrived in New York in 1977. My parents were born on kibbutzim in Israel, on communes in Israel, agricultural communes in Israel that their parents had founded. My grandparents from my father's side arrived in the 30s, in the early 30s, and helped build up a kibbutz called Beit Alpha of the youth movement Hashomer Hatzair, which was the first socialist Zionist youth movement. And they became Palestinian citizens. They lived as part of that community until, of course, the war and became Israelis. On the other side, my mother's parents, my mother's father survived, escaped Treblinka, made his way after fighting in the woods to Israel, where he founded a kibbutz called Megiddo. And my mother's biological mother had a very stormy, she was also a survivor, the only survivor of her family. Um, Ended up leaving, but my grandmother, who came from Marrakesh, Morocco, ended up living with him and raising my mother on Kibbutz Reshefim, also in the Beit Shan Valley. And so my parents, who were born in those kibbutzim and lived there and came to New York as artists, my mom was a dancer, my father was a painter, decided to stay for a bit, and I was born in New York and raised in New York. I'm a proud product of the New York public school system, as well as the third generation of my youth movement, Shomer Hatzair. And I would go every summer to visit my grandparents and my family in Israel, and I always knew that I wanted to return to live in Israel. And so when I was 19, after serving in multiple different positions within the youth movement, I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel, and I joined a group of people from my youth movement living on the border of the Gaza Strip in a little very progressive settlement called Kerem Shalom, and became a peace activist working in the Gaza Strip and in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And then after a year of doing that work, I joined with the rest of my cohort, the Israel Defense Forces, and served for 3 years. And as I was finishing my service, the attacks of September 11th happened. So I rushed back to New York to be close to my family. I was raised in Lower Manhattan and ended up staying for school in New York City. So I ended up doing my undergraduate at Columbia. I did a little bit of a graduate degree at the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS. I did two more graduate degrees, a master's in public administration and a master's in Jewish studies at NYU, and founded an organization at the time called Present Tense that helped develop the field of social enterprise. It was a network of accelerators that addressing questions facing the Jewish community. And that's what brought me back to Israel. So I've been kind of in between all over since. I founded a med tech company in 2012. I ended up being the CEO of that. Was a diagnostics company in cervical cancer. In the global south. So I worked across 42 countries in the global south, and then founded, when that was acquired, founded another company that helped governments in the global rapidly developed diagnostics for COVID. And throughout that period of time of building companies and building institutions, I constantly was involved in writing and trying to explore the world of ideas because I've always felt um, a drive to be part of the conversation. So that's kind of the flow of where how I got to today and this book that you showed, that being Israeli after the destruction of Gaza, is in many ways a culmination of that more intellectual work that I did throughout the 21 years of building companies. That is the side work, so to speak, which really is what speaks to my heart, which is trying to understand how we can be in this world and what values we can pursue in order to make the world a better place.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot, and that's a really broad palette of things that you do. You talked about social enterprise, I think. And so
Yeah,
my first question is, so what do you mean by social enterprise?
sure. So I think that we are on this earth for too little time to pursue financial profits alone. And I think that anyone
How
who
dare you say such a thing in
I
America?
know. Capitalist system, right? I mean, I've thought for quite a bit that it's such a funny thing that we expect people to be kind and caring and supportive in their personal lives, but all of a sudden when you get to the office, you can be an asshole. And from my perspective, that makes absolutely no sense. My actions, whether they're intermediated through a company or whether they're direct to another person, are my responsibility and my accountability. And therefore, when one works, when one develops, one should create things that help other people. And the energy that those things give back should help fuel that work. So social enterprise is the recognition that you can build things that people pay for that actually make a difference in people's lives for the good. And I started Present Tense because um, I felt that there was a disconnect at the time between the Jewish idea of creating a world that is tov. I've been talking for a bit, and I'm crediting here Rachel Goldberg, Poland, um, where John, Rachel, and a few other people that I deeply admire, Mark Chess and Aaron Horowitz and others, and Matt Krieger, have been talking about this idea of the difference between the kind of English concept of good and bad and the Hebrew concepts of tov and ra or lo tov. In Hebrew, the word tov comes into play when people do things that are narcissistic, that hurt other people, that don't recognize the importance of mutuality and community. And that I think that's social enterprise. Social enterprise is tov. It focuses on how do we build things that are good and not just build things that extract for us value or money.
So at these organizations that you founded and worked at, what do you actually do? I mean, you wake up in the morning and you check your email and then what?
Well, I mean, in each case, I was the founder and CEO, and what that meant was that I had to chart the growth of it. It's being in many ways the father of the organization, where father and mother, I guess, it's the parent of the organization, where you start it, it has a life of its own, but you need to continually help support it as it grows. By helping it to find its path, by recognizing the puts and takes, the compromises one needs to make as it grows, finding the resources to feed it and grow it in a healthy manner, um, and then creating a set of rhythm and ritual that allows for it to take on a life of its own, so that you can eventually leave and for it to continue to provide value in the world. And that's what I did across, well, present tense for sure, and mobile ODT. Present tense continued far after me. We hired other leaders and they built it out and finally merged into organizations in the United States and in Israel that brought its insights in and helped continue the work. And mobile ODT, through its acquisition, continues to help healthcare workers address the scourge of cervical cancer and hopefully put a dent in it. Mobile ODT, Covelocity rather, the company that I currently, founded and run, was more of a way for us to be able to serve the immediate needs of COVID, and now is a way for me to continue to do the work with organizations to help them develop innovation support vehicles to solve challenges that they're facing with new solutions.
The Cervical Cancer Project is amazing because as I read um, from you, I think somewhere that says it is a scourge. It's awful, and it can kill women. And yet, it's not that hard to cure. And so, you're bringing the cure, I think, to African countries. Is that right?
And Latin America and Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. Yeah. I mean, the global South, it's the leading, it's the second, maybe it might be by now the third, thank God, but it is one of the leading causes of death for women, despite the fact that you can catch it in less than 5 minutes and you can treat it with the equipment you have in your kitchen. It's like the easiest, nobody should die of this disease, and yet it destroys too many lives, hundreds of thousands of lives a year, and there's no reason for it. So, I mean, my co-founder, Dr. David Levitz, who has gone on to found another company in the space, realized that with his expertise in biomedical optics, he could identify the malignancy of the cells prior to them becoming a problem, just visually. And that by being able to put that on a technology that was being developed when we started it, which was the mobile phone and its camera, it just changed the game. Just changed the game. And so we're fortunate to be at the right place at the right time with Levitz's expertise, insight, and I just helped build the organizational vehicle to get it out there.
So, you anticipated my next question, which is you don't have medical training. So, how on earth did you get involved in this project? But it sounds like it was through collaboration with this doctor.
That's right. I mean, what the thing that I've learned over the past 21 years is how to start things. In the end, organizations are just collections of people. And this goes back to this concept of Tov and where kind of the Jewish concept of the good is. In the end, what you need to know is how to bring people together to work towards common cause. And then what are the infrastructure you need in order to maintain that, to grow it, to expand it, to get people to perform, and all of that process. It doesn't matter whether it's on my wrestling team when I was in high school or my youth movement throughout high school and then later it's just it's a skill that you learn it. And that's something that I've been very fortunate to be able to learn through just repeat exposure. Constantly starting new things, you learn what it takes to start something new, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But as long as it's aligned towards creating a better planet, better planet for humans, then I think that's and for other non-human species, I think that's a good thing. At least you try.
So, let's say there are young people watching you talk on this podcast, and they want to get involved in some kind of social activism. They want to make the world a better place. And they say, I'm very discouraged. The world's a terrible place. And so I'll volunteer for whatever organization seems to be effective. And so they go and they volunteer 5 hours a week, and they feel like they're not having much impact, but they feel better about themselves. That's nice. But what advice would you have for that person who wants to actually have an impact, actually do something, and not just think, I wish I could do something? Because I think that feeling of despondency, of the world is out of control and it's out of my control and there's nothing I can do, so I think I'll scroll through TikTok instead. I think that's really prevalent among young people. So yeah, what what takes you from where you are now, which is sad and lonely and not knowing what you can do, to actually having a project which brings, cervical cancer treatment to people who wouldn't have it otherwise? What are the steps?
Other people. In the end, it's about building a community and a community that has purpose. So it always starts with other people, and to be able to understand not only what's the problem you're trying to solve and how you're trying to solve it, but what's in it for those other people to join you in the solving. And then find those other people, first one and then two and then more that are willing to take that time and do that work. That's that I mean that those are the steps. And just like the best time to start a new project is yesterday and the second best is today. And you just have to start. And it's one of those things there, it's really easy to say, but it actually is also easy to do. You just need to get over that hump. And I think that the biggest challenge that are facing youth today is that the digital technologies they use are antisocial. So finding those other people and working with them is becoming increasingly difficult a generation that is so deeply neurologically stimulated that they don't think that they need someone until they're deep down in the pit of despair. And I see the difference between Israeli youth and American youth in that regards, which I find to be fascinating. And I'm sure that I'm overgeneralizing on the American side for sure, and possibly also on the Israeli side. But what I see with my children's generation is that they definitely use digital technologies, but they're increasingly rejecting them. Um, Israel has such a strong culture of Shabbat, where even the non-religious will recognize the importance of coming together for meals, coming together for family activities, and that repeat exposure to the importance of being with other people is really, really foundationally important. Where in America, what I found is that so much of the intersocial relationships are based on competition. In school, you're competing for the best grades. In different teams, you're competing to win the tournament. And yes, there's cooperation in the small group, on the team level, but for the most part, you're even competing against your other teammates because you want to be able to be the best athlete or be the best scorer, or you want to be the best on tests, you want to go to the best college. There's a level of atomization within the culture, and Americans tend not to get together on a weekly basis for meals, for activities that have nothing to do with competition and grading and so on. And so I wish for America to find that space where it has the ability to bring people together, because that's the fundamental skill that's required to be able to solve problems. Even solving your own problems, but definitely solving communal problems. It's knowing how to sit with other people that share different perspectives, have different priorities, have different backgrounds, and finding a way to work together in order to achieve that which you think needs to be achieved, and recognizing that failure is part of the process of learning and growing.
It's funny that our social networks actually are really more antisocial networks, and it's a huge challenge for kids. And I just retired, but I taught college students and graduate students. And one of my undergraduates told me, I know I'm addicted to my phone, but that's how that's my social life. It's kind of the focal point of social life. And I, the recognition from this student that he was addicted to the phone and understood it. That was new, actually. I think I
Yeah.
hadn't been hearing that in 5 years ago. I'd never heard that. But we have a ways to go. And so let's say you're that student, um, and you want to have more of these real life connections. Um, how do you start? Because the world is the way it is, and it gets kind of encrusted in habit and custom and the way things are right now. How do you break that mold? Because it strikes me that you're kind of a mold breaker in what you do. Your projects are all new. So yeah, how do you break out of what everybody else is doing?
Well, first, I think that what you just said is really, really important and powerful. And I think that the one of the big mistakes in our discourse around social networks is that it's not the social network, it's not the technology that's the problem. It's the profit incentive that's the problem. And regulating what content would go on a network is not the right way to go about it. It's understanding that the very business model is based on the exploitation of people. And it's one of those things where I edit and publish this journal Prophecy, and one of Israel's longtime critics of social networks, Guy Rolnick, who's the editor and publisher of The Marker, which is Israel's premier kind of journal, business journal, wrote a piece where he compared it to sending kids into coal mines, where back in the day it just made sense. They had small hands, so they could do better work. Um, and it was, I mean, nowadays it shocks us to think that kids were sent into these situations. That was a business model problem. We still needed coal if we wanted to power our society. Whether we did it effectively, responsibly, and so on is for a question. But the industrialization process, which led to better standards of living for human beings, was one that required energy. But we didn't need to send kids into those situations, and we didn't need I mean, so it's the business model that's the issue, and I think that's the fundamental shift that I think that youth, that anyone, I mean, not only youth, I know kids, I know people my age. I'm 47. I know people my age that are addicted to their phones as well.
I'm
That are
62 and I know people my age and 10 years older who are addicted to their phones.
yeah. And so the first is keep Shabbat. It's an amazing technology. It is an unbelievable breakthrough. We've only had it for a few thousand years, and it's been the most important piece of technology, the most important tool that the Jewish people have had to keep us as a people. I
So
was saying,
talk about that a little because there may be people watching who don't know what it means to keep Shabbat. What do you mean by that?
sure. So whether or not you believe in there being a creator or an eternal life force, whatever word you want to call it, God or what have you. Um, what the Jewish people did many years ago is decide that one day a week should be special. One day a week should be set aside. And that day is a day of not creation. It's a day of rest, recognizing that most of our weeks we're engaged in creation. We're engaged in manipulating the world around us, changing it in order to make it, what we want it to become, extracting from it what we need to survive. It's a day of struggle. Um, the Jewish tradition points it in the perspective of good, of creation. But there's one day in which you don't, in which you're together. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the incredible rabbi of the 20th century, called it a Palestine time. Chada'am, Asher Ginsburg, one of the great early Zionist writers, said that it's more than the Jews keep Shabbat, Shabbat kept the Jews. That this day a week in which you don't do, in which you are together, you eat meals with the people that are proximate to you, you attend services if that's what you do, you don't communicate on your phones, you don't watch television, you disconnect from stimuli beyond the people that are around you, and maybe and definitely a good book. That's incredibly powerful because it reminds us that the people that we're with are the people that matter. And matter the most. They're the ones that affect us, that 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 change our moods, that see us when we're sick, that take care of us when we're down, that we celebrate with. And then having to decide who do you want to spend those 25 hours with? We celebrate Shabbat for 25 hours from sunset to star rise. Who do you want to spend that time with? And does that make you happy? Those decisions are really important and create a rhythm for life that I think sets people in a completely different path. So I personally believe the first thing you have to do is turn off that phone for those 25 hours. And my wife now turns it off from Friday afternoon until Sunday morning, even because she realizes that during the week she's so stimulated by so much work. She's constantly answering. She runs a marketing and branding agency, and so she's constantly answering people, solving problems, and so on. And to have that time where she just has been revolutionary.
It's so easy whenever there's an idea, be it brand new or 3,000 years old, for people to say, no, no. The answer is no. And I'm hearing my students in my head saying, that sounds so good, but I can't turn my phone off. I have to be in touch by phone. Everything happens on the phone. So I don't know, maybe people need to think about incremental steps, maybe an hour off of their phone for
Cold
starters.
turkey. You put it in a drawer and you forget about it. For the first time, it's going to be hard. You're going to want to open that drawer. Look, luckily enough, it's not like heroin, right? I mean, yes, the serotonin, hits that you get are significant, and the neurochemistry changes are real. But anyone can do it. We've been doing it for thousands of years. But yeah, I
Okay,
hear you
so
about your students.
yeah.
It's tough. Yeah. Anyway, I think that. I mean, that's not the only way for people to start new. initiatives or join initiatives and join with others to solve the world around them, of course. Finding a cause that matters, that really rattles you, that you think about when you're in the shower, or that, bothers you is like an itch that you need to scratch. Joining others that are doing it, taking on what are called atomic tasks, taking on simple and achievable tasks that help further that cause. Those are all things that also are obviously building blocks of changing the world.
Yeah, I find that it can be so hard to start to actually do a thing. For instance, my whole career I've been a French horn player. That's, believe it or not, my job. And there are times when I don't want to practice. But if I take my instrument out of the case, I'll practice.
Yeah.
So really all I have to get myself to do is take the horn out of the case. If I want to go running, which I would never do in this smoke, but if I want to go running, I've never once in my life put on my running clothes and then not run.
Mhm.
So it's these first steps that can be hard, but to do. But if you figure what is the very first thing I can do, that's easy, atomic, like you say, the first little building block.
Put your phone in the drawer.
Put your phone in the drawer, call a friend, or go knock on a friend's door.
You make plans the old way. You say, hey, you want to come for dinner? Yeah, 7 o'clock, be there. You close the phone and they come. And if they don't come, then you don't invite them next time. But I know it sounds crazy and I sound like an old man now, but like in my day, people knew how to make plans and stick with them.
Yeah. Yeah, we even existed without smartphones.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It is crazy. All right, so you got into writing your perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on a long time now. I mean, this version of it even has been going on a long time, the larger version much longer. And you wrote this book, and the title is obviously a response to Peter Beinart's book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. So, and by the way, for people who are interested, you were interviewed by Peter Beinart in a somewhat contentious interview, I think it's safe to say, and it's pretty interesting to watch. And there are definitely lots of points of view on this conflict, right? But what was your motivation for writing this book, which is a series of interviews of people kind of all on the liberal side, but with really vastly differing ideas, points of view, opinions about what should happen next? So what's the motivation to do that? And then you have some interpretation of your own, but largely you let your interview subjects speak for themselves. So I'll just dump all of that. What led to this, and what are you thinking about it now?
So I wrote the book because after after the war, the current war that Israel's been fighting against its assorted enemies, entered a new phase, and Israel was, in my opinion, clearly engaged in um, uh, the destruction of Gaza, for its own sake, not necessarily to end Hamas. I think at that point we realized that we weren't going to be able to, using that strategy, end Hamas's grip on the Gaza Strip and the threat that they pose Israel. We also, I think, realized that we weren't going to get the hostages back, our loved ones that were taken in captivity, without negotiation and compromise. And yet, the government of Israel, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, our longest serving prime minister, continued a callous and violent and vengeful war. And I was very distraught by it. I was really distraught by it because I'd spent the year before October 7th, along with the majority of Israelis, protesting on the streets against this government. The democracy movement in Israel started after the current Minister of Justice's January 4th speech in 2023, where he announced the government's intentions to centralize power and turn Israel basically into an authoritarian, majoritarian state. So for a year, we were protesting. I had taken a sabbatical a year prior, and I continued my sabbatical to volunteer full time with the protest movement, with the democracy movement. And after October 7th, continued also volunteering then further to try to figure out, where do we go from here? And when the war entered that new phase, um, I was distraught. And but I started reading in English Peter Beinart and others, Avram Borg and Shalom McGee, the people who, there was a time that I felt very ideologically not aligned with, but maybe in the same camp. But Peter definitely ideologically aligned with at a certain point when he was at the New Republic. Um, and I was shocked. I was shocked by what I was reading. I was shocked because the the sentiment was that the destruction of Gaza was a bankruptcy of Israel, of Zionism, and that it proved that the Jews don't deserve a state of their own, and that we need to forfeit our power and sovereignty and basically start again for the sake of Judaism. That was the argument that all three of them made and many other made. And I felt that that was not only um, wrong. I emotionally felt it was wrong. It was difficult for me to find the words to explain why, but also that it didn't take into account the fact that you have the majority of Israelis protesting this government, disagreeing with the actions, committed to the future of the state, recognizing their accountability and the need to be able to build a state that we can be proud of and that our children deserve. And it didn't see them. All these books and articles and stories painted Israel in the colors of a government that represented 30% of Israelis. And I felt that that was malpractice. I just felt that it silenced us. And so my goal initially was to just find the words. And so I started these conversations. And then I decided to turn them into a book, as a response to say these voices deserve to be heard. But what happened through the process of speaking with people is that I found my own words to be able to explain what I believe. But two, I found hope because, I think that, and this goes back to this conversation about how do you, dig yourself out of the ditch of despair and start fixing problems around you. It starts one step at a time. The only people that are going to change the world are you and me, are us, meaning anyone that's listening to this. We're the only ones that are going to change the world. We can't put it on anyone else. If there's a problem that exists out there, we need to solve it. And in order to solve it, we need the power to be able to solve it. We need to be able to build the energy that will allow for that change to occur. And so it's human beings that make a change. It's not, grand ideas. It's human beings that understand the importance of how those ideas fit into their understanding of the world and how those understandings can help make their world a better place. They make those differences every day at a time. And I felt that Peter was ignoring the now 70% of Israelis that believe that Israel not only are not going anywhere, but also Israel, deserves to realize its potential as a place that represents who we are as Israelis, many of us as Jews, and I wanted to share that with the world.
I was thinking when I was kind of going through in my head what we would talk about, I was thinking about the fact that if you take an Israeli, let's say we've got a 30-year-old Israeli and a 30-year-old Palestinian. These are two human beings, and they probably can have great discussions with each other and talk. But when you get to the level of the government, you have suddenly problems. So how can that's going to be a multi-pronged question. But first of all, how can we empower the individual human beings in these two parts of this tiny landmass to find their own solutions, and start something? And that's kind of part one. Or here's the other part of that. What is that first step, like putting on your running shoes or taking your horn out of the case? Because if you're one of those people, it doesn't, it feel like I'm not gonna make world peace or peace in the Middle East. And so again, there's like a despair about this, and we see our students just completely erupting. So what's the first step, and how do we get this to be a people with people solution rather than thinking that these governments are going to find a solution? Because we've had a lot of different governments, and there's never been a workable solution that's lasted at all.
I think the first step is to imagine a future that works. I think that too often we're caught in what hasn't worked and in recrimination cycles of, but we were in the land before you, but we were in the land before you, but you did this, but you did this. And we go through these cycles in which we're trying to explain why we are right now, as opposed to trying to think about, well, what could work? What could work? On a fundamental level, meaning, and I'm talking about for the extremists, right? Take some of the extremists. One of the things that most people, again, why the book was important for me to express was that in the media of the global north and much of the global south, for the most part, Israelis are represented by either extremist settlers or the ultra Orthodox. Those are who they show. Any one of the articles, you'll see that that's who they take pictures of. The ultra Orthodox
What
because they
percent of the population does that represent of the Israeli population?
less than 20%, less than 30% of the Jewish population. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy that that is the Israeli that they show, but it works because it works for the narrative. The ultra Orthodox look like Jews did in anti-Semitic propaganda, and so it's all something that people immediately see. Somebody with side locks and wearing black, and all of a sudden that's a Jew. And so they use that because it's the most visually evocative, and then the extremist settlers because it works for the narrative. And so, but they make such a small percentage. One of the things that people don't realize outside of Israel is that the settler movement in Israel has failed. It failed to convince Israelis that living in Judea and Samaria, which are historically, accurately, the heartland of the Jewish people. That's why we're called Jews, because we were raised in Judea, right?
So that's the West Bank, right?
Well, I mean,
Basically.
nowadays we call it the West Bank of the Jordan River, right? But whatever it is, that area that people, are feel is contentious, that's where the Jews came from historically. But Israelis don't want to live there. 500,000 Israelis, Jewish citizens of Israel, live right now in that area out of 7 million Jews. And the majority of that 500,000 live there for tax purposes only. It's cheaper and they pay less taxes. Only a small percentage of those people live there ideologically. And then when you ask even those people, what do you want? They say, we want to be able to visit the shrines of our ancestors and not be barred from them. By the way, they're not wrong. There's a few places in the world where Jews are not allowed to step foot. One of them being on the Temple Mount because it's controlled by the Muslim Waqf, even now under the state of Israel. Another being in Arabia, where there were large Jewish communities, and now more and more now Saudi Arabia is allowing Jews in, but previously Jews weren't allowed. And in certain areas of the Jewish heartland, where for decades until Israel recaptured those areas, Jews weren't allowed to go. We weren't allowed to go to the cave of the patriarchs. We weren't allowed to go to the cave of the grave of Rachel and others. So they're not wrong, meaning access to religious sites should be open for everyone, in my opinion. I think that's a fundamental liberal value. But does that mean that the Palestinians shouldn't have self-determination within that same area, given the population demographics? Absolutely not. And if you go to what you want the future to be like, and what's a workable solution in the future, and you disregard the past, you don't try to fix the past. You're not going to. The past is broken. We can't take away the accident, but we can rehabilitate towards a place where we might be able to actually live together. And so I think first start there, which is what's a workable solution? What's a workable solution not to the problems of today, but to how we want to live in the future. And that's where I think that people need to go. In the book, we have multiple people expressing different ideas of what those futures are. But the fundamental variable for Israelis on the left and the right, religious and secular, within the liberal democratic camp, and I'll define that camp in a second, is that we want to determine our own destiny. We do not want to be citizens within somebody else's state. We don't. And maybe that doesn't seem logical to people who, are living within the United States of America and see themselves as a minority within a democratic country. But for Israelis, we just don't want to constantly have to explain ourselves to other people. We want to live as we are, just as the Palestinians want to live as they are. And that should be right. That should be okay and accepted for everyone. And just to finish, and I know I've spoken a lot, but just to finish, and that's a fundamentally liberal value. And I think that that's the thing that really bothers me about anti-Zionism. Liberalism at its core, I've learned, believes that every human being has equal value. Whether you want to cast it in religious terms that everyone's created in the image of their creator, or in philosophical terms that every human being is equal, every human being has equal value. And therefore, every human being should have the ability to decide how they're going to live and participate in decision making for how their community is going to live. That that leads to democracy, meaning liberalism is the foundation of democracy. Without it, democracy doesn't exist. But also, because liberalism is the foundation, then it must protect against the rule of the majority from taking advantage of or taking away the rights of the minority. And that's liberal democracy in a nutshell. And you can believe that from religious grounds, and you can believe that from secular grounds. You can believe that from right-wing grounds, you can believe that from left-wing grounds. But that core of people who believe that above all else, all humans are equally valuable and deserve a right to determine their own destiny, that, in my opinion, is the foundation of Zionism. And it is the foundation of a recognition that the Palestinians deserve to have a state of their own. And that's why I think that we need to start there, just by starting with the human and then saying, okay, now what's the future for these humans and how will they be able to live their fullest lives without inherently clashing and taking away from the other?
That's a lot. Let me ask two questions as I keep doing. Um, One is, I've really been engaging with this conflict pretty hard for the last number of years. Talked to a lot of people, and there are many people who think that the notion of a Jewish state is just odious and unacceptable, and that is Jews and non-Jews alike. So I wonder if you could respond to that.
I just find it funny because that is the most imperialist thing one can say. What imperialists say is, we will tell you how to live. We'll tell you. We know better. We know better. You can't live the way you want to live. We're going to draw lines on a map, and you need to just make do with the people that live within those lines. Okay. All right. And anyone who says that to people that live across the ocean, they're imperialists fundamentally. I mean, so they are the thing that they're saying that they're protesting against, and that's just ridiculous on such a level. Now, that's also my issue with Peter Beinart, which I said to him, and I also wrote in my follow-up, which has the video, which is that if you are a citizen of the United States of America and you are advocating for the United States of America to use its power to impose a territorial imposition on another people, you are an imperialist. And you will use the violence of America to tell other people how they must live their lives. And if you're okay with that, just say it. But then how are you better? How is that valuing equal human life and the dignity of choice? It doesn't. So I think that if you are a citizen of a country and you believe that country needs to take a different path, and you argue it with your citizens and you build through that a political movement and you work towards those ideas, that's the right method of change. That's the role of a citizen within a community. But to force others to act differently because you think it would be better, that's just, in my opinion, immoral and imperialistic and anti-Jewish on a fundamental basis. The Jews, other than one notable exception, Never told other people what they needed to think.
Okay, here's the other part of this, and in the spirit of getting you even more riled up, is one narrative that I've heard a lot, especially from people who call themselves anti-Zionists, is the narrative of settler colonialism,
Sure.
which is, I think, a slippery concept because it is not outright colonialism where, or let's say extractive colonialism, where my people go to a impoverished country because they mine molybdenum and we buy all the molybdenum mines and take all that money and send it back. And then those people who've been living there, maybe for 2 or 3 generations even, they can go back to the home country when things become unsettled. And this is, I think, very much not what happened in Israel. So the question is then, what the hell is settler colonialism? Does it have a meaning? Does it have some sort of spark of truth? Or what is meant by that? And what are the consequences if it has a spark of truth?
My father works as a shaman for the past 4 decades. And he was inducted as a Yachak in the Ecuadorian tradition, um, under a teacher in Iluman near Otavalo. And in his time in Ecuador, he connected with the Tachila people. It's a tribe of people that originally in the 1400s or so lived on or near the island of Puerto Rico. And due to invasion and war between tribes and conquest, they ended up settling in Ecuador. And they now live in Ecuador for almost half a century. Are they settler colonialists? They don't consider themselves. They consider themselves indigenous, but they're not from there. They went and settled as refugees because they needed a place. And now they have a place. I just think that the very concept that people are it's kind of like they took Plato and Plato's Republic, not Plato's Republic, and they not the laws. And they translate it into modern political theory as if people are the metals of the earth on which they live. And that's just complete and utter hogwash. It has no connection to the way that human beings have shifted across the world and changed in their positions. Doesn't recognize, human dynamics in any way, shape, or form. And I find it ridiculous because, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that people are trapped within the lines of geography that they've determined need to exist, even if they're being persecuted? Does that mean that refugees shouldn't be able to leave their countries and find themselves in other areas and create political communities that reflect their values? Does that mean that only a certain person decides where another person can live? I don't think that they would agree with any one of those statements. And yet, the people of Israel who have our name from the land, which has been kept within traditions, not ours. I mean, in the Quran, there's Bnei Israel or the children of Israel. It's in Jesus preached as a Jew in Jerusalem. I mean, we don't need to don't take our word for it, as they say. So for us to that where we were persecuted and kicked out of Baghdad and Marrakesh and throughout, I mean, and Berlin and Poland and found ourselves the only place that would take us in, and then are being punished for that. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense to me.
So I think Peter Beinart would say, and I try to be like a learner in all of this. So
Of course.
um, I want to bring up the opposing points of view
Of
so that we
course.
can get the dialogue advanced. So I think what Peter Beinart would say to that is, well, the Jews who are currently in Israel are doing the exact same thing to the Palestinians. They're not giving them the opportunity to settle there, and they also belong there. And I think I mean, I live in Madison, Wisconsin. That opinion is probably 95% of the residents of this city probably would agree with that. How would you answer that?
First, that Israel is imperfect, just as any other country, and that there's a lot to change. But changing that does not mean imagining that the whole enterprise is rotten to its core. And that the work that we need to do is to identify the future we want and to band together with people in order to make that change. And make that change from the inside, not impose it from the outside. Second is that he's just wrong when it comes to Israel and its citizens. I mean, just it's just wrong. I mean, look at Lebanon. Lebanon is the image of what Peter Beinart wants to impose on Israel. It's the exact image. Colonialists decided we're not going to have a Christian state and a Shia state and a Sunni state. We're going to package them all together. Why? Because the French said so. And so they created a political system in which each community has a place in its government and can make decisions and so on and so forth. And the result? Civil war, decades of civil war, a failed state. Exactly. I mean, far better starting place than Israel in the 1920s and 30s. Far worse by any measure than Israel today. Lebanon actually is an apartheid state. It actually has laws barring Palestinians from different places of employment, from different positions of power. Actually, Israel doesn't, has none. Israeli citizens, whether they're of Jewish or non-Jewish descent, can participate equally in government, can participate equally in the economy. There are no laws that bar them from professions. Evidence for that is the fact that there are Arab Israelis, some call themselves Palestinians, some don't, who are sitting in the Knesset, who are voting for bills, who are doctors and lawyers and accountants and within every profession. Beinart, with all due respect to where I think he wants to do good, has simply imagined a world in which Israel is unique and decided that he knows enough to be able to impose through the power of his empire a solution upon its people, by hook or by crook. And that is a fundamentally illiberal approach that I'm unwilling to accept because it says that certain people know better than other people.
A colleague of mine with whom I've talked about the Middle East quite a bit, who is Muslim, um, said that in her opinion, that piece of land should be open to everybody, and that the Jews and the Palestinians will get along as they have for millennia. And I worry about that because at least in my lifetime, that seems not to have been the case. And I also worry about it because there's been so much killing right now. And earlier in our conversation, you said, let's not think about the past, let's think about the future, which is beautiful. But there's also recently, within the last 4 years, lots of death, and it's impossible to sweep that under the rug. So we do, I think, have to consider where everybody is psychologically right now, and we have to surmount that. I'm interested, we have a few minutes left. I'm interested in, I don't expect to see the Israeli government or Hamas saying, let's solve this thing right now. That's, I think, not where it comes from. So I want your thoughts on where it could come from realistically at the level of the people, at the level of a person like you who says, I want to have an impact. I'm going to put my shoes on and go running.
Yeah. So first of all, in this coming issue of Prophecy, we have a an incredible article, which I'm finding the so I don't screw up the name. A Muslim scholar by the name of Iqbal Akhtal wrote an article on preventing the destruction of Muslim-Jewish relations, and in it he addresses this narrative that Jews always lived great under Muslims, which is sure as second class citizens I mean, you want to talk apartheid, this was far worse than apartheid. My grandmother's father, my great grandfather in Morocco, was punished for once riding a horse because Jews in Muslim lands weren't allowed to be higher up than Muslims.
Well,
So
it says it all when you said when the Jews lived under Muslims, because we don't want a situation where people are under other people at
But
all.
Well, but that's, I mean, but that's the situation, right? And so I think that the idea that empires always say that things would be better if people just listen to their rules, right? I went to the Metropolitan Museum the other day, and you look at the controversy around calling the land of Israel, which is what it was called for thousands of years in all of different scholarly texts outside of European Latin texts. And they call it Palestine even during a period where it clearly wasn't Palestine because it was pre-Roman. But then you look at the exhibit that explains the Romans, and they say that the tribes all benefit. I have the picture of this. The tribes that the Romans conquered all benefited from the peace and security that continued after the Roman Empire. Okay, right? I mean, the idea that if we just listen to the Muslim empire and everyone will just live peacefully and happily like we have lived for thousands of years. Really? I'm not interested in being a second class citizen. I'm just not. And I'm not interested in making anyone a second class citizen either. I think that human dignity is equal and should be equally weighted. And so anyone that says that anyone else should be living in the way just by their rules doesn't make sense. I come back to this definition of liberalism, using the English term. B'Tselem Elohim, the idea that we live in the image of the Creator and we have a role in the creation, which requires us to recognize our equal value. I think that that's the fundamental value that we need to structure our society around. And our society is tov, it is good, only insofar as we respect the mutuality of relationships that allow for us to create a world that reflects the needs of people within it. Well, back to your question of to, just to human beings have an amazing ability to forgive and move on. And we see that across the European continent right now, where peoples that had warred and killed each other for thousands of years, and really in the 20th century now, play soccer games and go out for beers. We see it in the relationship between the Jews and Germany, which, 5 years after the Holocaust, all of a sudden Israel was benefiting from Germany in a way that it never could have imagined before through loan guarantees that allowed Israel to build its industrial base. We're seeing it, you see it across the world. Humans have the ability to move on. And so I believe that we can move on. It's just a question of understanding what we want to move on to. And I think that is unfortunately not spoken about a lot because it doesn't make people angry. It doesn't trigger their receptors in the way that social media knows how to do. And I think that the hard work that those of us who really care need to do is to start imagining that future together and then listening forward. That is listening towards that future. What are the different interests, initiatives, values that will enable us to walk towards that future together?
I think that's a great place to end.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much for this
much.
opportunity. Of
Thank you for your time.
course.